to talk about how to make good shareable R code, and why science would like you to try it out too. Um, I am from the Atlas of Living Australia, which is Australia's largest data infrastructure biodiversity information. So any government, researcher, museum, or citizen scientists through apps, all of that information, when they take an observation of an animal or plant or fungi, that goes to the Atlas of Living Australia. And my job is to help people, particularly researchers, use that data more transparently, more effectively, more reproducibly. So this is very much stuff that I'm thinking about at the moment. To start, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work, which are the Darawal, Wandi and Gadigal people of the Yuin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal or Torres here today. To start, we're going to go left field and talk about cooking videos. I don't know if you're like me, but I get a lot of these in my feed. I think it's because I like cooking, but also they're very nice to watch these days. People are very talented at videos. And I don't know if you've ever tried to look some of these recipes up. Sometimes they're behind a paywall or you can't find them. And so you can't always get the recipe. So sometimes you need to just try using the video itself. And when you start to try, you realize that you can't really do it. First of all, sometimes they say it's going to take 30 minutes. It doesn't actually take 30 minutes, of course. Sometimes they're using ingredients that you realize you actually can't get in your local area, or it's some sort of special thing that they have. They're using equipment that they maybe haven't told you. They're omitting steps sometimes. And in the end, you might be trying to make something like on the left. I mean, I've actually never tried to make a beautiful little bear, but you end up with something horrific and kind of slightly scary thing on the right. And that's the difference between your expectation and reality. And honestly, I think that feeling is very similar to the feeling of when you're trying to run old code as well. I mean, you want to be like a kid, but more like on the right. It never seems to be as easy as it's sold. Now, I've already given a little intro of what I currently am doing. I originally did a PhD in evolutionary biology at UNSW in Sydney. And there's a lot of overlap in my PhD with psychology as well. And then I did a few little projects here and there, and I ended up moving into the public sector, working in Indigenous mental health, and now I am where I am. But over my PhD, there was a little bit that happened to me that changed my outlook on things. First of all, I started reading more, and in particular, these sorts of books were very pivotal for me. The one on the left was a very famous one in psychology for kind of calling out or talking about the issues with psychology right around when that was happening, why it might not be as robust of a science as people were saying in the past. The middle book here was an awesome introduction to the philosophy of science and understanding how knowledge building happens. And I mean, it talks a little bit about the nature of truth building or discovering that kind of truth. And then on the right here, I read this it probably was after my PhD, but I would say it's probably a better version of the book on the left. It's a lot broader. I think Stuart Ritchie's actually given a talk at SORT before. But again, it made me question how trustworthy science can be given the incentives of academia at the moment. You know, science isn't flawless, and it's difficult through all those different incentives to find the actual way that science operates. Simultaneously, this happened like pretty much as I started my PhD. You might recognize this plot. This is the famous replication crisis psychology paper where they tested 100 studies, tried to replicate their effects, and only 39 of them replicated. I also like to share this one, which happened kind of towards the end of my PhD, from Anne Scheel. And here they tested paper standard report papers, so just like a normal paper that's submitted to publication process, and found that they could replicate that first hypothesis result. They got a positive effect 96% of the time, but if they were asked to register first, so register their methods and hypotheses in advance, closer to like 40 to 50% of those were positive results. So there's something going on here where people are shifting what they're finding after they're running the experiments. Now, ecology and biology also aren't immune to these wider issues of scientific research. I think psychology was just in the weeds about it a little bit earlier. But I've seen this paper shared in Sortie before. This is from Hannah Fraser and colleagues, where they asked about 800 ecology researchers what it is that they do, whether they do engage in any of these practices, basically. And some of these things are, not recording variables, changing results a little bit after they know what's happening, after they look at the data, rounding things, excluding data. And I think often a lot of these sorts of things happen over the review process. A reviewer might ask you to shift something, or maybe you need to change an analysis in some way. And so inevitably you might end up doing things. It's not nefarious. You just have to do it to get the publication through. But in the end, these are still questionable research practices, and they're prevalent in ecology as well, and it can lead to issues of replication. But this is talking about primarily doing an experiment again on new data and trying to replicate those results. But what about using the same data and the same analyses to get the same result from a paper? Now, the good news is that researchers are sharing their data more. Here, this is a plot from a study in 2023 where they looked at papers in quite high ecology journals, ecology letters, nature science. And on the left, you can see that a lot of researchers are sharing data with their publications these days, about 80%. But on the right, you can see that only about 20% of them share their code. And there's a lot of papers that actually look at this these days. They kind of hover around that area, especially if there aren't policies to have your code submitted as well. So people aren't really sharing their code. But even when there is code, often it doesn't really work correctly anyway. So I've collected a lot of different studies. It's not just ecology, this is psychology, biomed, where they did have the data and the code, and they tried to rerun the results again. And you'll see that things are generally hovering around, 50% or less on whether they could actually reproduce the main results of a study. And what that means is that whether a code script reproduces results usually has a lower chance than a coin toss. I'd like to know where Arch Miller was looking that top result. Hopefully things are tracking that way, but that just doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. So what we're finding out is that reproducibility is actually very hard. And there's a lot of things that probably need to be solved before we get there. Now, at the Atlas of Living Australia, a lot of my work is supporting good coding practices, good scientific practices. The ones on the left are packages that we've built. Some of you might be familiar with Galah. This is how you can download data from the Atlas of Living Australia, but also other nodes like GBIF. The middle is a website that has how-to articles on how to use that data, and usually they're articles that take you from getting the data all the way to some sort of data viz or result. And then more recently, we have this book on helping people clean their data, which is kind of a weird question in ecology because it's so varied, but some sort of place where people can learn how to do that with code using best practices. All of these things, the goal is to help people write code more easily, make code that's easier to read, and also write code that's easier to repeat, all about reproducibility, transparency. And the reason that we do that a lot is because a lot of researchers use code, but very few are actually trained in how to do programming. You imagine yourself as some sort of effective coder, but honestly, a lot of us jump into it without knowing what we're doing. And so sometimes it can feel hard to actually know how to code, or it can feel frustrating. But the other effect of that is because a lot of people don't have that experience, it increases the chances for messy or broken code in science compared to other fields that use code. And on top of that, there's a big workload of learning how to do open science practices, and code is included in that. People tell you that you need to be doing open science practices, but there's a lot of things to learn to be able to do it effectively. And when institutions aren't really changing how they value that kind of thing, you're still rated on getting your publication through. Open science can feel like a ton of work, possibly not a worthwhile thing to do. And I think when you combine all those things together, ultimately, you have your confidence and you're worried that you're going to get criticized. Oh no, your code's not good. It doesn't work. I'm finding something in your code that you didn't see. I think people are quite afraid to be sharing things if they're uncertain about what it is that they're exactly sharing. But things are changing. You might have seen that this is from this week. More journals are starting to require that code is submitted with publication. This is PLOS Biology, pretty high up journal. Other journals have code policies as well. I know Nature supposedly has one. I'm not actually sure how effective they are in asking for it. But nonetheless, if you want to publish now in higher journals, sometimes you actually are required to share your code. So there's good incentive there. But even more than that, reproducibility is fundamental to science. So, a lot of the work that researchers are doing is to find significant results. But if someone can't reproduce that result and actually verify that it happened, they can't build upon it. It makes it harder for knowledge building. And I don't know if science can actually progress when it's impossible to do that. So today, I'd like to help with that. I'd like to talk about how to make our code reproducible, and give some tips about not just that, but kind of some formatting things as well in a workflow that I've found works for me, and hopefully I can share with you. So to start, I'd like to look at a code snippet and let's see if we can make it reproducible. So here it is. What it does is it loads some packages in, it downloads some data using that Gala package I mentioned earlier. It grabs some counts from that data as well, and then it makes a map at the bottom. And at first glance, it's probably not very clear that that's what this is doing. You probably missed that in the middle of all of that, I changed all the column names. But I think that's kind of the point. It's a little bit messy. It's hard to read, but it's not uncommon for people to write code like this, especially if you're in a rush. I know I've definitely written things like this before. So let's clean it up. And I've done that here. I've added a title. I've added some nice sectioning. You can see the steps a little clearer where I'm downloading things, I'm filtering things, I'm joining things, and then I make this map. So my code looks a lot nicer. But the thing is, this code reads better, but it's actually no more reproducible. And that's because code reproducibility depends entirely on the reproducible work environment, which is set right here. This is a very common way to set things in R, but it's a very rigid way to set things, and it makes it very difficult to reproduce this script if you're sharing it with other people. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is making a shareable work environment, because it's very important when it comes to reproducible code. One of the first things you can do is make an R project. I'm sure probably all of you or most of you are doing this. And if you're not, it's really easy. You just go file, new project. You can make a directory or you can use an existing one. You add a name and then create project. Very easy. Now, what's actually happening when you do that is our projects are creating this .rproj file, and that just basically tells R where your folders, or sorry, where your project's top directory is. When you use it, now R can know that you don't have to start from the absolute bottom of your computer's file path to build something. It will start instead from that top directory, and everything is in reference to the top directory. If you've tried Positron, which is Posit's new IDE, that's an alternative to RStudio, it actually handles that on its own without our project files. So those don't exist anymore. You just open the folder and then everything works. So it's taking that extra step out, but the idea is the same. There's some sort of top directory and you're referencing it. Our projects also work nicely with the here package. This is something I use all the time. And basically it detects that R project file or that top directory as well, and it'll print out that full path safely without you having to do it yourself. And also, if you're writing long file paths, often slashes can matter. I think it actually changes depending on operating system sometimes, but yeah, the direction of slashes can be a bit fiddly. So on the bottom here, you can see you don't actually have to use slashes at all. It'll do it for you. Another thing you can do is use GitHub, which is an online platform for storing project repositories. I'm sure probably everyone here has at least heard of GitHub. I'm sure many of you are using it. Um, it can feel like a really intimidating thing, but some sort of place to put your code is very important. Um, I think the main selling point of GitHub is that it is one place to store your project online. It's your complete project generally, and uh, it's easy to share. So the ability to store things not on your computer safely is definitely one important aspect of keeping things preserved. The other thing that it does is versioning, and I'll get to that in a second. But if you're unsure of what that is, I encourage you to try GitHub Desktop because it's quite visual to understand what's going on with GitHub. But here I'll go through it to show you. On the left here, you can see some, bolded like short descriptions of something that I might have done. These are my commits. And in each of those, I changed some files, which you can see here in that kind of lefty middle column. And I've selected one, and in the green, you can see the code highlighted that I've changed in this commit. And all I have to do is push that online, and that'll be available. And GitHub will preserve all those old changes as well, so I can go back and find them. And if anyone's changed anything themselves, I can pull that in, and it'll change my local directory. So a very cool way to store things, very effective. I think if you use code, you probably are looking, at least it would be beneficial to you to use something like this. And the reason for that is I think people often talk about that as like a code collaboration tool, and that's absolutely true. If you're collaborating with people, GitHub's great with code. But a lot of scientists don't actually collaborate when they're writing code. So I don't know if that's the best selling scientists. But there's some other things that I think are really, really helpful. One of which is you have a front-facing README. It's formatted really nicely. If I go back here, this thing on the bottom, you can add photos, you can add headings. It's a really nice way to document and remind yourself how something actually worked. Um, it's also really easy to share projects with others. So instead of bundling up something into like a zip folder and then sending that to someone, and usually there's limitations about how much you can send, this is everything you need for that project in that one place, and you can share it with a link. People can get it on their local directory using GitHub. I think it's a lot more efficient. And really, the important point here is you can find your old code pretty easily, and you can copy paste it when you need. So just as an example, here I'm finding a file that I have on GitHub, and I'm looking at its history, and there it'll have every old commit that's happened to this file. And if I click on one where I think that maybe there was something I cared about, I can scroll down. Oh, and there's some code that maybe I deleted or changed in some way, and I can copy paste it and put it back in if I need. So there's a lot more safety in having GitHub around in case you try something out, it doesn't work, and you forget how you did the first thing. Now, I'm not going to go through how to set it up, but essentially you just create a GitHub account, and you'll need to introduce yourself to Git and R on your local computer. I use this Happy Git and GitHub for the use R. It's an incredible free book, and I encourage you to try that out because it makes things very easy. And for those of you who are more advanced, if you use the use this package, you can actually do GitHub things in your console. So here I'm using the use GitHub function, and it will detect that I'm in a project that I've just made. It's now creating a repository online for me, and setting everything up that I need, and then it'll take me there and open it in my browser, and it's all built. So if you prefer doing things in R, use this has made this crazy easy and it's very fast. So it's worthwhile checking it out if you want. Another important thing is to have an organized folder structure. This is kind of, it feels straightforward, it feels boring, but it's harder to do as your project gets bigger, more complex. This is a kind of straightforward example that I've had for a recent project. But the point here is that you might need to edit these folders to make sure that they don't get too big as your project grows. It's also important to have readable file names. Um, Now, Janie Bryan calls this the file name Holy Trinity, and I actually encourage you to watch her talk instead of mine about why this is so good. But basically, uh, your file name should be machine readable, human readable, and play well with default ordering. And by that, I mean, here I have some bad examples. It's using acronyms. There's no structure to those names. They're vague. I don't know what's going on. On this good side, though, there's a date, usually in year, month, day, which organizes a lot better on your computer. And then it says what it is. Like I have Bandicoot data, or it's a map, and then here's what the map is. And notice that I've used an underscore to separate those things. So there's a date, underscore, and then what it is. So you can create these patterned sections of information in your file naming. And that means that if you actually ever have to deal with this in code or you need to search for something, it's easy to separate those things out. You can read them quicker, but also your computer can read them quicker. And so with a little bit of cleaning, you can like do loops on them and things like that. So it's good for your machine as well. A very important part of this is to record the packages that you are using. I'm sorry. Let me drag something out of the way here. Okay. It's important to record the packages that you're using as well. And here there's a lot of options in R to do this. You can use renv or renv. Actually, I'm unsure how to pronounce that. This one's quite famous, I think, and that's because it's fairly comprehensive and it's very easy. So you just use these three functions, and it will take a snapshot of your environment and all the packages and the versions that you're using. And if anyone wants to use them again, they use restore on their own machine, or you can as well, and it'll load all those old versions back in. It's a pretty comprehensive solution to it. It's not perfect just yet, but yeah, I think that's probably R's best package for ensuring that everything's documented really well. Groundhog is kind of like, so instead of documenting it using this sort of like LOC file, which is how RN works, you can load a specific package from a specific date. So if you have that kind of documentation, you can grab those quite easily. I actually haven't found the need to use this just yet, but it feels very lightweight. So I think it could be a good solution. At the very least, you should be printing your session info at the end of your code or at the end of your processes. You know, when you're finished, what did you use? The nice thing is if you do it with this report function from the report package, this will format it into some sort of like PDF text version, and you can share that with your publication as well. So I think this is a lot nicer for if you want to share this kind of information with your publication. And just to give you an example of what I was talking about with RN, you just initialize RM in your project library, and then when you run snapshot, it saves this file with all this documentation of what you're using. So it's, yeah, as I said, it's comprehensive. It's a very good one to use. Very important is to back up your data. And I think probably all of us in some way know this. I've recently dealt with problems just this week about this. But it's important to back up data locally and online. You should have versions of data that work on your local computer, but you know, computers don't last forever. So it's important to have it online as well. There's lots of options for this. Zenodo, Dryad, the OSF. These all let you store data on them. And if you're worried about sensitive or restricted data, you can embargo your data, which basically just means putting a delay between when it is put online and when people can actually see it. Or you can restrict access with a password if it's private data, for example. So in general, there's less reasons. I know that's a fear for a lot of people, is putting it online is scary, but you can control this with these sorts of services as well. Another option you can generate DOIs for your data. And this is actually the strategy we've taken with. And the reason this works is because DOIs persist even when URLs change. So for example, here, I'm using the Gala package to download some Bandicoot data. And in this line, I specify that I want to mint a DOI with this. And so when that download is finished, it'll append it to the actual object. And so if I look in its attributes, it is assigned a DOI. And if I use that DOI in a separate download and filter by that DOI, I'll get those occurrences exactly as they were from my original query. I use this all the time in the data cleaning book that we wrote, and it's I think we're about 2 years on. It's still really fast and stores things exactly as they were. So if you didn't know about this functionality and you use Atlas Living Australia or Gala, I encourage you to check it out. Okay, so let's go back and look at our code snippet. If we followed all of the steps that we've just gone through, the real way to make this more reproducible is actually removing this line. You don't need it. You've already stored all the information you need for your environment, and your code should be much more reproducible. And just as a case in point, this is a recent paper from Kellner and colleagues where they looked at whether our code worked in papers on species distribution and abundance. And this is a pretty fun little plot, kind of looks like a hand, I guess. But if you follow the green, you'll see that there were about 500 papers that they originally tested. Only about 140 of them actually had code and data that they could use. And of those, only 36 ran. In the yellow, as you follow the little hand shape, you'll see that a lot of the main issues are missing objects, missing files, deprecated packages. These are pretty much things that are due to an environment not being reproducible. So this is an important part of keeping your scripts working for other people and yourself. Okay, so the next part of this is making shareable code. And interestingly, it's kind of opposite to the point that I made earlier. Making nice code doesn't necessarily increase reproducibility, but I actually think it's an important part of it. And the reason is I think that anyone, experts and non-experts, should be able to read your code and know what's going on generally. They might not actually know how to code at all, but they can see, okay, they filtered, they got this data set, they made this model. The general steps should be quite clear. And even within those steps, the lines should, make some sense. So let's go back to our original code snippet. As you can see, as a reminder, it doesn't look very nice. The first thing we can do is write code like we write sentences and just add some spaces. So I've already done this here. This is a very R thing, but I think that it makes it far more readable because there's a little bit of separation between everything. And already, I think it looks a little better. What we can also do is break tasks into smaller code chunks and add line breaks. And what that does is it allows your code to breathe a little bit. So I did this earlier, but what you can see is all of these now have quite a distinct step in our code. And you can very easily from afar pick out that, okay, I've got the data, I've cleaned the data. You can actually see that I've got some counts. I've joined those counts and I've made this map. So even from afar, the code's quite clear. Now, if you're uncertain how to clear your code, or maybe you've written a lot of code and it would just be a total nightmare to clean it, you can use R formatting packages. These are really fast. They're very easy. Air is the brand new one. It's wicked fast, and it's actually the default in Positron, and you can make it so when you save files, it automatically cleans your whole file, which is really cool. I found it a little bit in your face. I haven't quite exactly figured out my perfect balance here, but it was originally based on Styler, which is something that I used all the time. And that's what this GIF is showing in the right. Basically, it becomes a part of an RStudio add-in, and you can highlight a code chunk if you want, and then go to the add-in and go style that section, and it'll restyle it. And actually, one of the best ways to use that, I think, plots, sometimes, you don't know which way to sometimes you have things that are in one chunk and then you might spread something out. That makes it all standardized. It makes it so much easier to read. So I encourage you to do that. Naming things can make a big difference in your code. And anyone who's ever coded before knows that this is so much harder to do than it sounds. So here I have some bad examples and I have some good examples. And in the bad, the general thing to avoid is acronyms that you don't remember. I actually don't remember why I said BT. Um, Avoid unclear names, avoid vague names. Say exactly what it is. Like I have data of cockatoos, so cockatoos. Maybe you grouped them, grouped. I'll remember what that is. Um, and I actually don't think you should be too afraid of long names. I think sometimes longer names can help with context, but too long and your code becomes quite crowded. So if it's really long, like the one on the left, there's probably a way to shrink it just a little bit. It'll still make sense. The same pretty much goes for functions. You know, be clear with what they're doing or avoid ones that already exist. Um, and in general, your function name should start with a verb and say generally what they do. So, get counts has an outlier. When you write functions that are like that, it makes your code far more readable when you're applying them. Something that's bespoke to scientific coding is that your variable names in your code eventually should match the ones in your final paper. And over the course of writing your paper, those might change. You might, adjust the terminology. So it's important to actually go back into your paper and make sure that those all align. It'll make it a lot easier for reviewers, but also your code will actually make sense in the context of your paper. Something else I also think is a good idea is to define your variables in a README or in the Quarto or a Markdown file that you're using. And I have an example here on the left where I've just listed all the columns in my data set and I've said what they are. And I also say how they're measured. The nice thing about that is then you don't have to say how they're measured in the column name itself. You can use this as a reference and then it'll keep your code and your column names a lot shorter, a lot easier to read. Um, I think everyone knows that code comments help in making your code clearer. I think in general, it's good to keep them short but informative. And if you have too many long comments, I think it's a good indicator that code is actually a little bit unclear. And as an example, if you look at the code that we made earlier, you actually don't need many notes. The code itself is clear as it is. And sometimes you put in a little header or say what a certain line does, but you actually don't need many notes to keep code clean. What I think you should use long comments for is to discuss why you did something. And often for scientists, that means interpreting some sort of result of a test or some sort of operation. So here's an example. I just have a quick collinearity test where I check the correlation between the two variables that I might use in a model. And here I've written that two of them seem to be really highly correlated. And so to avoid multicollinearity, I'm just going to include two rather than all three. This is really important for making your code clear, but also helping you remember why you made the decisions you did over the course of your whole analysis. Now, sometimes you actually can't avoid complex code, but what you can do is break up those steps into smaller variables or functions to make it easier to understand. And this is generally known as using explaining variables. So here I have two code chunks and they do exactly the same thing. They make a package, or sorry, they download some packages, they make a hex grid, and then they filter that grid to only hexagons that are over an Australian landmass that I've defined. This is the beginning blocks of how you would make a hex map of Australia. And on this last bit on the left, you can see that that line is pretty long, but it works. It works totally fine. But yeah, not that easy to understand. What I've done on the right here is I've taken out the step where I identify what hexes are on the Australian land, and I put that into something and I've called it hex on land. And what that means is that when I eventually do that filtering, it's very easy to read what I'm doing. What is the filter process that I'm doing? This takes a little bit of practice. So, I wouldn't expect to do that immediately after seeing this talk. But if your code is really long, or, it can also be long chunk wise, there's usually a way to separate certain things, call them something else. And by the end, when you say what you're actually doing, it's a lot simpler to read the whole process when you're breaking things up. So it's a good thing to do to make your code readable. But what if you're busy? A lot of scientists have a lot on their plate. Sometimes it feels unachievable to edit in that way. Well, in my opinion, I think it's more important to make your code understandable than it is to make it brief or fancy. So, as an example, this is code from my PhD. I think it maybe was my second paper. And I didn't really know how to do functions, and I certainly didn't know how to do loops. And I was trying to take a really wide, messy data set and convert it to a cleaner, long data set. On the left here is a function. I mean, honestly, it looks pretty okay to grab what I needed. But on the right, I didn't know how to loop this because it was a bit bespoke. So I just ran it like 100 times and then I smushed everything together. And it's like, it's terrible, genuinely bad. But I guess the important part is that years later, I still can tell what this does. And I think I could probably use it again. And I think that's the point. So as a final step, I think it's important to have some sort of shareable output of your coding scripts as well. And I'm not just talking about figures here. This is a point that I don't know if I've seen many other people talk about, but it's something that I've found really effective in my own work and in my team's work. So I'll show you what I mean. So I think that it's good to render your code into some sort of output with your middle steps included. So here is an example of an ALA Labs article. As I said, it shows you something, you go from downloading data all the way to the analyses. And what you'll notice as you scroll is that these middle steps, where the data frame isn't the final data frame, but it's a middle step and you can see what the output is meant to look like. That's included as well. And we do this for learning purposes. We're trying to show you how to actually run this code. But the interesting thing is after we wrote these, we started going back to these way more than we were the actual code. And that's because it was pretty easy to see what each chunk was doing in general. It was a really nice way to document things in a really fast way. I don't have to load the script and run it to get the same thing. I can check what it was meant to do and then grab it myself. And we also found it was really nice because I've documented the whole process here. If I need to bug fix this, I can see what that middle filtered data frame was meant to look like. So I can try to match that with my fix if something's changed. Um, so like I said, it's really good for a lot of reasons. I'm not suggesting actually that you make that, and I'll show that in a second. I'm not suggesting you make that. That took a lot of work. It's part of my job. Don't do that. But what I'm saying is that rendering something at the very least requires for you to make your code run from start to finish. Your code has to go all the way through. This is, I think, kind of a problem for coders because when you code, and when you code quickly in particular, things kind of end up all over the place. You might run something here, you go back up here. Sometimes if you go all the way from start to finish, it doesn't work. And I think that causes a lot of issues with code. So this makes you do that. It's also way easier to share. Sharing an HTML file with all the output and stuff in it is a lot easier than sharing, an entire project with all the files that you need. And as I said, it's easier to bug fix because you have not just the starting point and the final output, you have everything in the middle so you can try to match it as well. So I think in terms of longevity of code, it's handy to be able to see how to make it work or how you could fix it. I mean, the main reason why this works is because of Quarto. If you haven't used Quarto, I very much encourage you to do it. If you're using our Markdown, it's pretty much the same thing, but the defaults are just much, much nicer. There's, a little bit of difference, but this is an example just from their front web page, and doing very little, it formats things really nicely. So you actually don't have to do any formatting if you don't want to. I think Quarto does a really good job on its own. But what I am suggesting you do, not to make a website or anything like that if you don't want, what I'm suggesting you do is you render your code at the very end and save it somewhere. Save it in one accessible place that you can find. It doesn't even have to be public. It can be private. But if you share it, with other colleagues or in your lab, something like that, it can be a really great place for resources for code. You can reference these, grab things for future things. Yeah, we just found it really impactful for our own work. So in summary, you can make your code reproducible if you do these things. Very importantly, making a shareable work environment will define whether your script is reproducible. But I also think it's important to make your code readable. It's more likely that people understand what's going on, will catch issues if they can actually understand your code. And similarly, if you render your code into a document, you can share it more easily, which I think will help people actually build on that knowledge. And it can also help you bug fix it later on as well. Now, getting back to why it matters for science, I kind of floated that a little bit, but it's good to finish on that. Um, you might have seen these plots before. They're from a paper by Elliot Gould and colleagues. Many of the colleagues are in Sorty. When they asked 174 analyst teams to use the same two data sets to answer the same two ecology and evolution questions. You can see the results were really all over the grid. The black line is no effect, and just through the analytic decisions, they're finding lots of different results. There's lots of variation in the effect size of that result. And I think this result isn't surprising. I think people know this, but I think sometimes scientists forget that just the analytic decisions, like forget about the methodology, the experimental design, the variation that exists in nature, just the decisions you make when you have the data set and you're analyzing something can have a big impact on what you're eventually finding. And every decision a researcher makes affects the result and its interpretation. And so to interpret scientific evidence, you have to be able to reproduce and interrogate the analytic steps that led to a result, because I think it can make a big impact. And that's the importance of making your code reproducible. Another topic that's talked a lot about in this group, because many of the members are on these papers, is research waste. This is the idea that you spend a lot of time designing an experiment, making the methods, getting the materials, going out and getting the data, and inevitably that ends up being lost. Like the data is misplaced, or it's not written down correctly, so you actually can't run that experiment again. But I also think this idea applies to code, very much so, because I don't know if you're like me, you might go and look around online for code to use in your own script, and it's easier to find code that is doing something similar to what you're doing. Or alternatively, you might be handed a script, from 5 years ago. People say this should work, and it probably doesn't. And that means that all that time, like if you've ever analyzed anything before, it takes a lot of time to do this. All that time spent to run that analysis is somewhat wasted because you have to start again to be able to run it all the way through. So there's an importance to making something reproducible, because otherwise you're not building on knowledge very quickly. You're spending all this time kind of catching back up. And it makes it a lot harder to use the investments that people are already receiving in the past to get to something new. And this is slightly adjacent to the scientific idea. I'll explain what, but I've been thinking a lot about this in preparation for this talk, and I thought I'd just pose it to this audience. I was thinking a lot about scientific code, and in preparation for this talk, I watched this presentation from Cara Thompson. She, I would say, to me, is like one of the god tier data viz R people in this space. And she was talking about the challenges she had making reproducible data viz in the context of making something like a standard data viz, and people were asking to be able to add more data. And if a data viz changes, it should be able to pick that up, and then which reports now you need to update. So there's a process that it would trigger. And she was saying that this is actually really hard to do. I mean, some of the problems she was hitting were when you do things like jittered points, so that way you can see them more easily on a plot, that's randomness. And you have to be able to hard code that randomness into your plot if it's going to be reproducible. Other things like R at the moment is very good at detecting formatting changes in text. So if the plot was exactly the same, but the format changed on everything else, it wasn't picking that up. So there were these software limitations that she was hitting, and she needed kind of these bespoke solutions to be able to get to the reproducibility that she was hoping for. And it made me think about a few things. One is that, the software that we're using isn't always perfect. There's always going to be limitations. So even when you think it's going to be perfect, sometimes you may have problems. So don't let that, affect your confidence, as we were talking about before. But the other thing is what she ended up choosing was kind of a programmatic solution. She ended up needing tests, and she needed like bespoke tests to be able to check whether these things are reproducing the way that she thought. And I was thinking that that's really different to how I think about scientific code. Um, that's more of like a functional programming kind of thing. So in programmatic code, when you're making a package or an app or something, you pretty much always use tests to make sure that everything's robust. You're using conditional pipelines. So like you're anticipating whether someone's putting something weird in. And usually you're regularly maintaining it because if you ever put a package in, for example, CRAN will tell you when it's broken. So you have to go in and actually fix it if you want it to stay online. And that's completely different to scientific code because, I mean, some people use tests, but that's a big stretch, I think, for a lot of people to use a test. And usually it's stepwise. You're not like coding for all these possibilities. You are cleaning the data in the specific way, then you're running an analysis. And maybe there's a little bit of flexibility built into that, but every data set is usually so different that that's really, really hard to do. So you don't really do that. And then at the end, it's not really maintained. The end result is that paper, that result, and you're not regularly checking in on it to make sure that it's maintained. So it's very, very different. And just like as a case in point, this is some scientific code that I pulled from an LA Labs article. You can see what I mean. You get the variables, you do this cleaning step, you build the model, you run the model. In programmatic code, this is from Gala. You can see here we're using this fancy switch thing to send people in all these different directions to all these different functions. And within one of those functions, there's some, conditional checking of whether it's right or not, some formatting, and then again, some more conditional stuff to, just in case. I think a major point here is if your code doesn't look like coder's code, that's totally fine because they're actually completely different. They're four different things. But I think an overarching point here is that, you know, this stuff is hard, and I don't know if scientific code is necessarily in the same vein. So I was thinking about reproducibility, and here's what I kind of came up with. You can make something absolutely perfectly reproducible if you want, but it takes kind of a bit of time. It's a bit of effort, and it usually requires more things. So, you use an RN. You might use Docker, which is, kind of a slightly different, more programmatic version of RN to make something, a perfect environment. To do that takes skill, but also to access that requires more skill. The benefit is that it is perfectly reproducible, but there is, kind of time sink in doing that. Not as many people will be able to access it as a result. Or you can make something more flexible, and it might not be perfectly reproducible, but you've documented everything that you need to run it again. If it breaks, it's much easier to share. It's much easier to access. But the problem is it's probably going to need some bug fixing. And I think in science, there's kind of this trade-off. There's such a benefit to transparency and sharing code and analyses because ultimately you want your science to be shared. You want it to be easy to interrogate for other people to find what you've found and to use it. But to be perfectly reproducible kind of takes down those barriers, or it creates barriers for that. And so I don't actually have the right answer, but I think it's worth thinking about what is important for you for reproducibility. If it needs to be absolutely perfectly reproducible, then it's worth building those skills into your workflow. But if something is beneficial to be shared, it might be worth thinking about how to do that the best that you can using the tools that are available. Just to finish up, here's some other things that if you're interested in this, you might also like. In particularly, I suggest this talk by Olivia Angeline Bonnet. It's pretty much similar to what I gave, but far more in the data science side. She gets into things like targets. I thought it was fantastic. So if you want to know more about how to make a reproducible R workflow, that's the place to go. And here's some other reading as well. Awesome. Thank you. And normally I have these slides here to share, but QuartoPub broke on me last night, so I actually can't, but I will share them as soon as I can. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Dax. I think we still have a few minutes for questions if anyone online would like to either raise their hand or put something in the chat. All right, I might go ahead and ask you one then, Jax. What would you say out of, you covered a lot there and talked about a bunch of different things you can do to um, improve the reproducibility of your code. Is there any one of those that you would say is more first priority than anything else? If you had to triage.
Um, yeah, I think definitely making your environment reproducible is top priority. And if you were to just use an R project, put it on GitHub, save your data somewhere, and record what packages you use, you're already like most of the way there. Um, I guess it just depends on whether, like I was saying before, if you want it to be absolutely perfectly reproducible, there's a little bit more effort that's involved. But if you want to be able to use that code again in a year and you know how to fix it really quickly, I think that is all you need. Just a record of what worked, because then you can kind of figure out why it doesn't work.
And then there's one online I'll just read out quickly. I just said that in ecological projects, we often work with messy data coming from different sources, field notebooks, lab measurements, historic data sets. In practice, this means a lot of manual data rescue, including before analysis starts. Do you have any recommendations for making this early data reconstruction stage reproducible as well, especially when the original data are not yet in a digital workflow?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard question. We hit this all the time, and actually not specifically me as much as some of my colleagues, but um, I think I don't know if you've ever encountered this targets workflow. Basically, what it does is it puts the steps in different scripts, and then you source that script at the end. So that way you have like data cleaning step at the start, maybe you have first data cleaning step, second data cleaning step. And when things need to change, you're only changing that part of the script. Um, but I think the reason you do that is because at the start you put everything you need into that script, and then as things are shifting, that script will refine. You can start doing that programmatic thing where you can use if-else statements. You know, you're now starting to defensively program. But the nice thing about it is you're bundling that step early on, and then the rest should run. You know the result that you need to get the rest to run, so you're not fiddling with some giant script. You're really optimizing this one specific part. I mean, that would probably be in the first case my suggestion, but I sympathize because it's super hard and joining things never goes the way you expect. So, I think maybe like having checks in place as well to be like, is that exactly the same early on also helps. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough problem.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Sarah asking, as a new PI who's never successfully incorporated GitHub into their own workflow, any suggestions for how to train the students to be better than they are?
Yeah, GitHub is so intimidating, and I really sympathize with it. All the words in it are scary, but ultimately, all you're doing is having a folder, remembering to save, but using GitHub to kind of do that, and then putting that online. Like I said, I think GitHub Desktop is probably the easiest way to start. I've taught students many times with it, and it's not that intimidating. Our studios one is starting to look that way as well, but yeah, I think that's a good starting point. And I think what you should do is just try. I did like an intro course at first to just get used to the words, but I didn't actually find that worked because they were using the code like git bash. That's so scary. GitHub Desktop, I did it on my own project just as an experiment. It didn't explode. Suddenly I felt, like I could actually do it. So, give it a go with a point and click interface, even though people seem to, not make you feel like that's a good option because it's the best way to learn.
All right. And then I think we have time for one more. Owen, did you want to ask that or do you want me to try
Oh,
and read
yeah,
that?
sure. I'm happy to read it. Yeah, thanks, Dax. It was an awesome talk. I really loved it and took away a lot of useful ideas that I'm keen to implement. Particularly, I think demystifying stuff around like package and environment management. I think I know RM is good practice, but I've always been a bit intimidated by kind of diving into it. So it's really nice to see how straightforward and practical you made it seem. Yeah, one thing I was thinking, you looking through your talk is like, oh, I wonder. I kind of put this coda at the end of my question in the chat that I know that the presence of generative AI and scientific coding is a kind of spicy and divisive topic, but curious about whether you see utility in trying to capture some of these principles in like an AI ready kind of recipe, maybe like a skills.md sort of like markdown format, or because it seems like a lot of them, it's the sort of thing where you could take a kind of piece of pretty shitty code that someone's written themselves in a messy way and automate a lot of the recommendations that you're making. To a certain extent, that takes the learning out of it. So that's less appealing for like, a student or someone you're trying to teach good practice in making good human readable code. Um, but maybe for someone who's like later career who like knows these things but kind of wants to take the legwork out of it, whether you would see value in kind of creating some automated tools to take okay first draft code and turn it into good practice, reproducible, well commented, well spaced, documented package versions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, good question. And yeah, like you said, I don't really know how I feel about AI. I think I don't like it. But in those sorts of circumstances where you're someone who knows what you're doing and you're trying to have it support your work, that can be really beneficial because it can be a slog, especially data, like this kind of cleaning operations can be really hard. Um, I would say maybe, but I think, I saw an interesting study the other day that was just showing when people are using AI, they're just less likely to retain the information that's actually in it and know how it works. And I'm
Yeah.
wary that if you're using, you can use it in the correct way, you ask for verification, but ultimately, it's doing something, you don't know where it's pulling that kind of code formatting from. It often is just taking it from programmers' code. And so sometimes it creates these weird hinges, like rigid switches that you won't know until that data changes and then it'll break. So I think, yes, you're right. It can really make things faster. And I think when you're talking about like setting up a workflow, it could definitely format things in the right direction, 100%. But when it comes to like cleaning code, I still feel that there is a risk of using AI because I don't know where it's getting its code from. And sometimes it's taking it from something that is designed to not be flexible. And I think that can be scary when it comes to reproducibility.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. I think we'll wrap it up there. And once again, thank you so much, Dax, for making time. That was really great and engaging talk. If you know anyone who might be interested in watching this, I will be throwing it up on the sort of YouTube in the next couple of days. Also, everyone keep an eye out in your inbox for a feedback form so we can get a bit of an idea of what type of talks people would like to see in this workshop and webinar series going forward. But hope that everyone has a great rest of their day. And yeah, see you next time. Thanks again, Dax. That was really great.
No, thank you. Um, Went longer than I planned, but that's
No
okay.
worries. No, that's perfect. Still time for questions and everything. So
That's right.
yeah,
It keeps those scary AI questions away.
cool. Yeah, I realize I'm standing in front of these frog tanks.
That's pretty cool.
But fun background. Anyway, yeah, I'll be in touch. I'll send you that link if you want to put it on your socials or whatever. But thanks again.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Sasha. Good to see you.
So, see you
Talk to you
around.
later.